That ancient gong ceremony that you paid $70 to attend, that was invented around the same time as the Nintendo Game Boy. Over the past couple of years, I've been tracing the origins of every major instrument that is used in modern sound baths. And what I found wasn't just surprising. It revealed how an entire industry has been built on myths that we've all been told, and even fellow sound bath practitioners have believed. So let's talk about where these instruments actually come from. I'm going to start with the crystal singing bowls because that's what made me start questioning everything. So you know what I'm talking about here, right? Those frosted white bowls that are made of pure quartz, supposedly, that produce this really ethereal resonant tone. They're often described as having roots stretching back thousands of years. But here's the actual story. In the 1980s, the semiconductor industry was booming. To grow silicon crystals for computer chips, manufacturers needed containers that could survive extreme conditions, like 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, twice as hot as volcanic lava. So they developed quartz crucibles, bowl-shaped vessels made from 99.992% pure silica sand, spun in centrifugal molds designed for semiconductor fabrication. These crucibles had to meet an incredibly strict purity standard for use in chip manufacturing, and the ones that didn't make the cut were discarded. Then someone discovered something interesting. According to industry lore, a worker at one of these manufacturing facilities noticed that when you struck these rejected crucibles or ran something around the rim, they produced a deep, sustained, resonant tone. By the mid-1980s, these industrial rejects started finding their way into the wellness community. There's documentation of someone selling them at the Bodhi Tree bookstore around 1986, claiming to be the first to market them as sound healing instruments. But the real transformation came in 1997 when William Jones and Paul Utz founded Crystal Tones in Salt Lake City. Jones and Utz developed a technique using vapor deposition, vaporizing minerals, gemstones, and precious metals at high heat and low pressure, fusing them to the surface of the quartz. Their first bowl, which they called an alchemy bowl, was allegedly created by infusing moldavite into molten quartz. They wanted to know what the periodic table would sound like. This was genuinely innovative. They saw potential in industrial objects and created something new, bowls designed specifically for sound therapy rather than just repurposed waste. But here's the key point. There is no historical precedent for crystal singing bowls as healing instruments before the mid-1980s. They just didn't exist. The oldest ones are younger than the CD. The alchemy bowls that are so popular now were created in 1997, the same year the first Harry Potter book was published. When I learned this, I started wondering what else I had assumed about these instruments that wasn't true. The next instrument I started learning about was gongs because I am obsessed with them. I love gong baths. They are my favorite sound bath instrument. I have paid money to lay on a yoga mat while someone has played massive gongs and talked about ancient Chinese healing practices and Tibetan sound therapy and 5,000-year-old traditions with the gong. But I'd never actually seen historical evidence of gongs being used as healing instruments in ancient China. Everything I know about this ancient culture did not point to sound healing. So I started researching, and what I found was fascinating. Gongs do have a legitimate ancient history. They are among the oldest musical instruments in the world, with archaeological evidence going back to 2000 BC and possibly earlier. And they were used for many things. In China, they announced the arrival of the emperor. Military leaders used them to gather troops and signal during battle. Buddhist temples use them as timekeeping devices, marking the beginning and end of meditation sessions, calling people to gather for ceremonies. By the 9th century, gongs had migrated to Java, and interestingly, the word gong itself is Javanese, not Chinese. The Javanese developed their own style with deep turned-down rims and a raised boss in the center, and created a gamelan, an intricate percussion orchestra where multiple gongs of different sizes played together in complex rhythmic patterns. So gongs have this incredibly rich history across multiple continents. They were used for music, for ceremony, for signaling, for warfare, timekeeping, religious practice, symbols of wealth and status. But therapeutic sound baths, where you lie down and you receive the vibrations, that part is new. The modern gong bath was developed by Don Corro in Los Angeles in the early 1970s. Conroe had studied under Yogi Bhajan, who had brought Kundalini Yoga to America in 1968, and quickly built a following in the Southern California spiritual scene. Conroe started experimenting with large gongs in a therapeutic setting, having people lie down and experience the sound waves washing over them, experiencing the physical vibration, the overtones, the way the sound seemed to move through your body. And he called it a gong bath. He's still teaching today, highly respected and still training gong practitioners. Conroe created something new, a formalized approach to using gongs therapeutically that hadn't existed before. He deserves a lot of credit for that. But the historical record is clear. Gongs were not used as healing instruments in traditional Chinese medicine. We just don't have evidence of that. There are no texts describing therapeutic gong sessions in Tibet, and the practice of lying down to receive gong waves and to meditate on them was developed about 50 years ago. Metal singing bowls are where things really get complicated and where we need to be careful about separating fact from fiction. Metal singing bowls, which are often known as Tibetan singing bowls, are everywhere in the wellness world. The name itself is really the first problem because there's very little evidence that these bowls are actually Tibetan in origin. Let me walk you through what we actually know. Bronze and brass bowls have been made in the Himalayan region, primarily Nepal and northern India, for centuries, possibly even over 1,000 years. But these were functional objects. They were eating bowls. They were storage vessels for water and grain. They were offering bowls in ceremonies and common wedding gifts. In Nepal, they're called dabaka, bati, or bata. All three words just mean bowl. And here's the key point. Tibet itself lacks the copper, tin, and other metals that are needed to make these bowls. The metallurgy skills resided with Nepali artisans who were renowned for their metalworking. Even bowls made by Tibetans were typically made in Nepal. So the term Tibetan singing bowl is recent. According to some sources, the name singing bowl was coined by a Nepali handicraft trader named Jeet Badahar Sahahi sometime after the 1960s. Before that, they were just called bowls. So where did the Tibetan come from? Well, in the 1960s and 1970s, Tibetan refugees fleeing the Chinese occupation began selling their possessions to survive, including these metal bowls. Western dealers realized Tibetan commanded higher prices than Nepali, so that's how they were marketed. However, this wasn't true. They were always made in Nepal. Now, the singing technique, this running a mallet around the rim to create sustained tones, this too has murky origins. There's very little documentation of this practice in traditional Himalayan cultures before the 1970s. Historical accounts of Tibetan music mention bells, horns, and gongs in ceremonies, but no singing bowls. The first major Western exposure was the 1972 album Tibetan Bells by American musicians Nancy Hennings and Henry Wolf. That album is credited with launching what we now call New Age music. It literally helped birth an entire genre. Singing bowls weren't used in traditional Buddhist practice. Many of the quote-unquote antique Tibetan singing bowls that are sold today are actually brand new. They're just made to look antique. There's an industry across Nepal, India, and China producing bowls that are artificially aged. They're treated with chemicals, they are deliberately scratched and dented, and sold with backstories about specific monasteries or generations of monastic use. The first retail store to sell singing bowls in America opened in San Francisco in 1974. By the 1990s, the supply of genuine antiques had already dried up. So what's being sold now is mostly manufactured authenticity. So what are we left with? These bowls do have genuine origins in Himalayan craftsmanship, primarily from Nepal and northern India, and some were used in Buddhist contexts, struck like bells, used in ceremonies, and so on. But the modern practice of playing them by running this mallet around the rim for sound healing and meditation, that appears to be a largely Western innovation from around the 1970s. The elaborate claims about ancient Tibetan monks using them for chakra balancing or about specific frequencies and sacred metallurgical formulas. These are modern mythologies crafted onto objects with actual cultural histories, but histories very different from what's being sold. As one scholar put it, these are Dharma products from Nepal or northern India that are no more sacred objects than Western crystal glasses are musical instruments, despite the beautiful tone that one can elicit from them by proper treatment. This doesn't mean that playing these bowls can't be meaningful or beneficial. I play them, I love them, but we should be honest about what we're doing. We are really engaging in a modern practice inspired by objects from the Himalayan region, but we're not participating in any kind of ancient Tibetan tradition. Koshi chimes were created by a musician and instrument maker named Kabir, working at the foot of the Pyrenees Mountains in France. They went into production in 2010. Kabir had designed a similar chime called the Shanti in the 1980s, and the Koshi was a refinement. They have bamboo veneer resonance tubes instead of metal shells, with 8 steel rods welded with silver into a metal plate at the base, precisely tuned. He created 4 tunings, each named for an element: earth, water, fire, and air. The construction is meticulous. Each rod is tuned to create what Kabir describes as a circular sound. The notes build and fade in mesmerizing patterns. What's interesting about Koshi chimes is how quickly they became a standard. Within a decade of their introduction, they were everywhere. That delicate high-frequency shimmer cuts through the deeper tones of gongs and bowls when you're doing a sound bath. They fill a sonic role that practitioners didn't know they needed until they heard it. Wind chimes, of course, have existed across cultures for thousands of years. In China, Japan, and India, for example, they're often used to ward off spirits or to mark sacred spaces. But their specific incorporation into Western sound baths happened organically, like so many other instruments, in the 1970s and 80s, as practitioners assembled their sonic toolkits. Chimes offered something that the heavier instruments didn't. They bring a bright, crystalline accent. They created textural variety, and practically they were very easy to play. You can make beautiful sounds without years of training. Kabir essentially designed the Koshi for this emerging market, and within just over a decade, you can barely attend a sound bath without hearing them. They are one of my personal favorites and one of the first instruments that I acquired. The handpan was created in 2000 by Felix Rohner and Sabine Scherer in Bern, Switzerland. The pair were steel pan builders. They'd spent years working with the Caribbean steel drums that originated in Trinidad. Then a Swiss percussionist named Reto Weber approached them with an idea. Could they create something inspired by the steel pan, but combined with elements of the ghatam, an Indian clay pot drum, so he could play it with his hands instead of with mallets? What they built was 2 deep-drawn steel hemispheres glued together into a convex lens shape, with tuned tone fields hammered into the top surface around a central note, and a hole in the bottom that creates bass resonance. They called it the Hang, which is the word for hand in their dialect of Swiss German. The Hang was difficult to obtain. Pan Art produced them in limited quantities. Each one was numbered and signed, with prices in the thousands of dollars. By the mid-2000s, other makers started creating similar instruments, but Pan Art had trademarked the name. In 2007, Kyle Cox of Pantheon Steel coined the term handpan, combining hand with pan to honor the Caribbean steel pan tradition while distinguishing these new instruments. The handpan exploded in popularity for meditation, sound healing, and street performance. Pan Art stopped making the original Hang in 2013, but by then there were hundreds of makers worldwide, and they were all producing handpans. So we've gone from Caribbean steel pans born from colonial Trinidad in the 1930s and 40s to a Swiss innovation in 2000 to mass-produced meditation instruments available online today. The sound bath world actively seeks out anything that produces resonant, meditative tones. And unlike gongs or singing bowls, nobody's really claiming these are ancient. The industrial materials would make that impossible. But just within the last 15 to 20 years, they have become staples of sound baths. The Sansula is one of the few soundbath instruments where we can trace a genuine connection to ancient musical traditions. But it's important to understand what that connection actually is. The Sansula was invented by a German company called Hokima in the early 2000s. It's essentially a kalimba, also called a thumb piano or an mbira, mounted on a wood frame with a membrane stretched underneath that acts as a resonator. The kalimba or karimba and mbira have deep, legitimate African roots. These are traditional instruments from various African cultures, particularly in Zimbabwe and surrounding regions, with origins going back hundreds or possibly even thousands of years. The mbira holds profound cultural significance. It was used in ceremonies for communication with ancestors and as an integral part of social and religious life. The concept is elegant. Metal tines of different lengths are mounted on a resonating board. You pluck them with your thumbs, with each tine producing a different pitch, creating cascading melodies with a distinctive metallic shimmer. Sometimes there's beads attached too, which create a rattle. Hokima took this traditional concept and added a resonating membrane underneath the kalimba. This amplifies the sound and creates a warmer, more sustained tone with really interesting overtones. It's a clever innovation, genuinely new while building on African origins. Here's what's important. Hokima doesn't claim the Sansula is ancient. They don't hide the fact that it's a modern German product. They acknowledge that it's based on the African kalimba. And this is one case where the wellness industry took inspiration from a traditional instrument and created something new without the fabrication of some sort of elaborate mythology. The African roots are real and important, and the modern adaptation is clearly stated. The Sansula stands on its own merits. It shows you can create beautiful instruments for sound healing without inventing false histories. Okay, now we get to the Native American flute. And this is where we need to tread most carefully. With the Native American flutes, there is real history that is sometimes ignored. These flutes do have ancient indigenous origins. Archaeological evidence of flutes dates back hundreds of years. Different tribes had distinct styles, construction methods, and cultural contexts. These instruments were used in courtship, ceremony, storytelling, and personal expression. They're real cultural artifacts with deep meaning. But here's the disconnect. The Native American flute that you encounter in a sound bath or in a wellness setting is often a modern commercial product that may have no connection to actual indigenous makers or traditions. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a surge of non-native people making and selling Native American style flutes. The New Age movement embraced these instruments as spiritual tools, which often stripped them of their actual cultural context because they were just repackaged as generic healing instruments. Today, you can buy mass-produced Native American flutes made overseas, often by people with no connection to indigenous communities. These are marketed with vague references to ancient wisdom and spiritual healing without acknowledging the specific tribal traditions that they're supposedly representing. Even when the flutes are well made, their use in sound baths often has nothing to do with how they were traditionally played or what they meant in indigenous cultures. They've been absorbed into a Western wellness aesthetic, decontextualized and commodified. So the Native American flutes are very different from the crystal bowl situation. Here, we're dealing with the appropriation of living cultures, taking culturally significant objects and using them in ways that don't have a connection to their origins, often without permission, frequently without any benefit going back to indigenous communities. Some native makers do create flutes for the commercial market and for sound healing use. When purchasing a Native American flute, it matters enormously whether you're buying from an actual native artisan who is choosing to share their craft, or buying a mass-produced imitation from someone exploiting an indigenous imagery for profit. I started this because I wanted to understand the instruments that I was hearing in sound baths, and what I found was more complicated than what I expected. I found genuine craftsmanship mixed with invented histories. I found real cultural traditions alongside strategic myth-making. I found ancient instruments repurposed for entirely modern practices. But underneath all of that, there's something really simple. Human beings have always made music. We've always used sound for ritual, for healing, and for connection. And we keep creating new instruments because sound moves us. And that's real. We don't need to embellish it. In my next video, I'm going to explore how this happened, how the wellness industry built an entire mythology around these instruments, how the ancient narrative became so powerful, and why being honest about the history doesn't diminish the practice, but actually strengthens it. If you want to see that, subscribe and hit the bell. Thanks for watching.